This is a little something I've been putting together for a while now. It begins with a story. Well, last year, I have a friend who's really into like records and physical media and stuff, and our city, Jacksonville, was holding a sort of physical media fair at a hotel, and he invited me to come down with him and look at some albums and stuff, and I was like, sure, that sounds like fun, just to look at some, look at these things. I always enjoy seeing like the art direction and the photography and stuff on display on the old records, and, even if I don't really have the money or space to be a physical media collector, I appreciate that scene exists and the service it serves, so I was happy to patronize it. So we went down there, had a great Saturday morning. It was really funny because it was a pretty even split. Half the people there were people like about my parents' age to my grandparents' age, and the other half were people like my age. So it was all like either like young, kind of like bohemian art people, or like grandpas. It was very fun. And so we were flipping through all these records, and later on, my friend Ray, he contacts me and he says, I've found this record when we were there and I got it. It's called Godzilla versus Your Mother. And he sent me a picture of the album art, and I totally understood why he got it because it was very, very interesting and funny looking. Like the cover, I'll try and put it in the notes or something, but it's sort of a cartoony drawing of a giant lizard being kicked by like a woman's foot in high heels. And on the back of it, all the track titles were palindromes, sentences that are spelled the same way backwards and forwards. And there was a bunch of just like really funny, like kind of kooky text all over it. And I got a good chuckle out of it, and I was like, this is really interesting. And then he was nice enough to record me, giving a shout out to Ray. He was nice enough to record me, do a rip of the album and send it to me. And I listened to it and I was like, this actually kind of slaps. I actually enjoy this a lot. It's 80s synthesizer music. The premise of the album is that it is the soundtrack for a non-existent film called Godzilla versus Your Mother. And it kind of follows those beats of a fake monster movie. I love synthesizer music, especially like period synthesizer music. So hearing these wonderful smooth 80s synths was really good. And after I listened to it, I was like, who made this? Because I've never heard, the composer was credited as Michael Perilstein, and I was like, I've never heard of this person before. And I'm not super into music, but I'm aware of like kind of the big names like Wendy Carlos and, Tangerine Dream. So I did a little digging online, and I found out that this record basically doesn't exist online. There's a Discogs.com entry for it, and there's like a couple eBay lots that were selling it, but like there's no way to listen to it online. There's not really any information about the composer other than just a list of a couple of his other albums, and none of his other albums I could find either. So I'm a big fan of the kind of the lost media community. So I was like, well, I should, do my part here. I have a YouTube channel, and this is obviously old and out of print, and I don't think anybody's going to, no rights holders are going to care about this. So I put it on my YouTube channel and got a couple listens and a couple of comments and stuff. People were into it. And since I was curious, I decided to do a little bit more digging because I wanted to hear more of this guy's music. And eventually I found a Twitter page under his name, _philosopher. I'm going to link to it. And looking through his Twitter, it was a lot of just kind of like sort of true to the name. It was kind of some philosophical musings and just sort of general notes about being positive and kind of little jokes. And I really liked it. I was like, wow, he seems like a really fun guy. And I've never done this before, but I was like, I want to learn more about this person. If I want to learn more about this person, I'm sure there are other people who would, especially since I've been getting comments on the, on the upload. So I messaged him, and I tried, just very nice and straightforward. I was just like, I found your album at the show. I really liked it. You seem like a really interesting person, and judging from the time period you worked in, I bet you have a lot of like really cool stories. Would it be okay if I interviewed you for my podcast? And he was incredibly gracious. We spoke on the phone a couple times before that and coordinating it. And both times they wound up being like very long phone calls where he told me some fun stories. He gave me some sort of good advice, both as an artist and just like, as a person, an older person has more experience. And I was really into it. So he agreed. And eventually I managed to sit him down, and I got 2 hours of his time, and we had a fun interview. And that's what I'm going to be presenting to you today, is that interview. Again, I know this is sort of counter-programming to our usual show, but I hope you get some enjoyment from this. There's some really good stories in it, and if you don't, like I said, just sit tight because we're going to have a new episode coming out soon, and I've got some fun guests lined up for future episodes as well. So we had to take a small hiatus because, some family issues and also, my unemployment and everything. But we're back, baby, and it's going to be great. So enjoy this recording. I'm going to include some resources in the episode description. So if you are at all tickled by this, feel free to listen to some of these tunes. And also, Michael is still working. So very long shot. But if any of you want like an actual authentic 80s synthesizer composer to make stuff for you, I'm sure he'd be happy to hear from you. He's still working, and also his heart's in the right place, and he has good politics, which is always a nice thing to find out with the older crowd. So, especially here in Florida. So, again, enough hype, enough talking here. Here's my interview with composer Michael Perilstein. Just as sort of a primer, he's done probably his most well-known film that he's done the soundtrack for is The Deadly Spawn, which Red Letter Media has done a video on. There was a recent re-release of their soundtrack on vinyl. The theme song to it was the lead into this episode, and it is just... I'm doing my Italian chef fingers right now. The synthesizers and those wood flutes, really good. He also did the soundtrack for Hollywood Chainsaw Hookers, which I've watched, and is, if you're into like kind of gonzo, low budget, exploitasty movies, it's definitely like a very wacky version of that. But his soundtrack is really, really sick. It just ties all together. He's also done a couple other projects I was able to find, and he was even nice enough to send me a copy of one of his CDs, The Least Worst of Michael Perilstein. It's like a sampler platter of all of his works over the years. So anyways, here we go. This is my interview with Michael Perilstein, and thank you for listening. Have a great day, and we'll be back with more Louis After Louis before you know it. There we go. I see you now.
You see me?
Yep, you sound great too.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, you sound very good too. So I can hear you. I can understand the language you speak.
That's good. If you need me to mess with anything, I can fiddle with my mixing board here.
Sorry, what?
If it's too loud, I can.
Just let me know it. I can.
I'm sorry. I know they're not funny. I know that.
No. Your jokes are. I love your jokes. It was just that's the thing that can actually happen. So.
So I'm not visual on here though, right?
Nope. It's just audio for both of us.
Okay. Well, it's good to speak with you, and I'm ready for whatever questions you may have.
I guess first, I would like to start with where do you come from? Like what's your background? And
all right. So you can ask me more specific questions about my background if you wish, but most of it is irrelevant, I think. I mean, my background, I mean, where I grew up and all that stuff has very little to do with who I am.
That's perfectly valid.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind you asking whatever you want. I have a boring background. I did boring things. I was a boring little child. And when I used to ask people questions and they said, what a boring little child. You're asking all these boring questions. Why don't you go to sleep? And I would say it's the middle of the day. But and I grew up to be a boring adult, but at least I had all these years of practice.
Well, I don't think you're boring at all, Michael. I always like talking with you. Well, I guess it's music is what brought me to you. I guess, how did you get your start composing? Like, how did you begin composing music?
Well, I love music. I can't imagine. I know there are people, and I've met a couple of them. They're really good people, but I've only met a few in my entire life out of the many thousands of people I've met, and I've met thousands who don't like some form of music. I couldn't live without it. I love music. It's the greatest thing in the world. To me, it just gives you something that you can't get any other way, as far as I'm concerned. It just, to me, it puts me somewhere else. So I was very little when I got interested in music. My parents were nice enough to take me to various concerts. I was at, as a little kid, I was at an orchestral concert. I think the first thing I was introduced to was probably, there's three of them. Nutcracker Suite, of course, that was just a standard thing, and which was wonderful. I love that. And Peter and the Wolf with Prokofiev music, which I love even to this day. I still think it's great. And Edvard Grieg, who didn't do a lot of music, but everything he did, I think, is wonderful. He's a Norwegian composer. His biggest composition is probably the Peer Gynt Suite. which is just beautiful music, just beautiful music. So from that point on, as from a little kid, I love music. I did get, I introduced myself to other music over the years, and a lot of it came from film scores, because film scores basically came from orchestral music. So I think some of the original film scores were by major orchestral composers like Prokofiev and Bernard Herrmann, who did Psycho and Vertigo, which is a great score, wonderful score.
Oh yeah, those are both all timers.
And it's a great film as well. And he would if you take the music out of those films, even though they're Hitchcock, and I think Hitchcock's the greatest director who ever lived, but if you take the scores out of those films, you still have a good film because it's a great director, but it's just, you lose a giant amount of impact. And so when I was a little kid, I would watch stuff like The Twilight Zone, which was it was my favorite TV show as a little kid. And I would, my parents wanted me to go to bed after it was over. And I said, well, I have to hear the theme song. I have to hear the theme music, rather. And they thought I just wanted to stay up later, but it was really, I do not lie. And I even as a little kid, I didn't lie. That was the reason I wanted to stay up, was to hear the music, which was, a lot of it was, the main theme for Twilight Zone was first written by Bernard Herrmann, and that's not the one that people are familiar with. That was the early first version. But the one people are familiar with was Maurice Constant. He wrote the main Twilight Zone theme that everybody knows, which I thought was a great piece of music. But Bernard Herrmann's music was used throughout the Twilight Zone episodes. He wrote a bunch of stock music, library music that I guess it was CBS owned, and they put some of it in Perry Mason, which was another great, at least the early episodes of Perry Mason were another great show. And they used Herrmann's music throughout that. And I just noticed that this stuff pulled me into the plot. I mean, I was glued to the TV when that kind of music, the suspenseful music, was in the background. It just pulled me right in. Fortunately, I was very lucky that we had a piano when I was a little kid, and I just played it. I mean, it's the easiest instrument in the world to play. If we had had a flugelhorn, I don't think I'd ever have gotten into music.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, because I've seen like every episode of The Twilight Zone, and that I get why they use the classic song in syndication, the da 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 da, but that original opening theme was much more ethereal and dreamlike, and I kind of like the mood that it sets. It's very good, and just all the music on The Twilight Zone is great.
Yeah, it really was. And then you had there was another composer too, who's everybody who likes film scores knows, because he's another great composer. Unfortunately, he's dead too. I know all these dead people. Jerry Goldsmith.
Oh, yes.
And he did a lot of Twilight Zone scores too. In fact, I don't remember the name of the episode, but there's a really great Twilight Zone episode. Doesn't help if I don't remember the name. But it was I'll tell you a little bit about it so that anybody can look it up if they want, but I'm not going to give away anything. But it's a great episode where it's the typical, it's just scary because it takes place in the 1950s America. Now, that was not when it was shot. It was shot in the 60s, I think. But it was, it was just the kind of stuff, if you ever look at old Americana, there's something really frightening about it. I mean, just the normal life of America in the 50s was just scary. It was like something out of a horror film. And in this episode, there was a teenage girl who lived right next to a house that where the people moved out, new people moved in, but they were on a motorcycle. And that was frightening, of course, because they were on a motorcycle. And like the parents were worried about her because she was being friendly with them. And that's all I'm going to say about it, because I highly recommend that anybody interested in the Twilight Zone find out what I'm talking about and look at that episode, because it's a great episode in and of itself. And it's just a fantastic example of the creativity of the music of Jerry Goldsmith, who scored that episode. So many times they just use library music in TV episodes, but occasionally they would actually get somebody to score it. And even John Williams, Star Wars John Williams, used to be Johnny Williams, and he did Lost in Space, and I think he did The Time Tunnel. I think that's just from memory, so I don't know if that's accurate, but Lost in Space is accurate. And a lot of these guys, I mean, they were just as great talents back then as they are today, or would be today if they were still alive, in terms of Goldsmith and John Barry and people like that. But Barry's British, so he had no American TV shows except Orson Welles' Great Mysteries. I don't know if that was in America, but anyway. So that's how I got started. That's what interested me. And as I said, a piano is real easy to play. You don't have to learn how to play it. You just play it.
Here, and just for you and the listeners, I looked that up. It's season 5, episode 18, Black Leather Jackets.
Yeah.
It's a very funny episode.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. That is the title. I recognize it when you said it. That's absolutely right. And I think it's have you seen it?
Yeah, no, I've seen every episode of The Twilight Zone.
Well, no, I mean, that's a good episode, and it's a good episode in and of itself. But then, of course, I watched a lot of films in theaters for the purpose of, well, first to watch the movie, to see how, to try and be just an audience member, to have a good time watching a movie. But I couldn't help myself. It's just part of my nature to analyze every aspect of it. And one of the aspects that was the most interesting to me is the music. And depending on the movie that I was watching, and so that's another way that I got into music, to answer your initial question.
That is really good, yeah. And I guess like in the days before, videotapes and DVD, home media, having the soundtrack was the only real way you could sort of relive the experience of seeing a movie. So I guess that gave it even more significance in a way that people now might not really have or appreciate.
That's true. And as I had mentioned to you previously, that one of my favorite composers of all time was John Barry. He still is. I mean, unfortunately, he died, and he's a great composer. He did a lot of incredible scores. I mean, just incredible music. A lot of them different from each other, but he's probably best known for, depending on which era you're looking into, but either stuff like Dances with Wolves and Out of Africa, or the James Bond series, which was always a favorite of mine, and especially his music. And when I was a little kid, as you said, you can't, in those days, it was before the internet. It was before we even had VHS tapes. We didn't have anything. So if you wanted to see a movie for any reason at all, whether it was to study the music and how the music was used in the film or whatever, you had to see it when it was in the theaters. So I would go, and I was a little kid, and I would go in the theaters. I'd pay to see Thunderball, for example, and then I'd go to the manager and I'd say, "Listen, I'm just a little kid. I really don't have enough money to see this movie as often as I want. But do you mind if I just, I've paid to see it a few times. Do you mind if I just come and watch it every now and then when the theater is not crowded?" Because in the beginning of the release of Thunderball, it was shown 24 hours a day, and it was crowded. You had people down the line blocks long, and it was sold out. And that's why they played it 24 hours a day. But eventually they had, empty seats in the theater. And the manager felt sorry for me because I was a little kid, and this is my little kid obsession was to watch this movie forever and ever. And the reason I wanted to study it. I thought it was very entertaining. And as a child, I didn't know why it was entertaining. And I wanted to sort of analyze it. So I would watch how it was edited, and I would watch how it was filmed, and especially how the music fit. And that, to me, was an incredible thing. There's a piece of music, as I told you, forgive me for this. It's the title of the music is called Death of Fiona. Now, I know I know that your partner is Fiona, and that's a wonderful name. I love that name. And it's the name of one of the main characters in Thunderball. But there's also a scene called Death of Fiona, and it's Bond is dancing in a nightclub, in the Kiss Kiss Club, which they called, they invented the name because in Japan, when Goldfinger came out, which is the film before Thunderball, that was a big hit. And the Japanese referred to James Bond as Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. And when they made Thunderball, John Barry wrote a song called Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, because that was going to be the theme song from the film. And they had Shirley Bassey do a version of it, and then the producer didn't like her version for some reason. She's great. She's always great. But for some reason, they didn't like it. So they had Dionne Warwick record it. She was great. But then the producer didn't like it because it didn't say Thunderball. So at the last minute, even though that film was like a chaotic thing for them to put together from everything. I've met a bunch of people who work on the Bond films over the years. And from what they told me, that was a real chaotic thing to put together. It was like they were working on it 24 hours a day, just about, to the very last second before they had a scheduled release. They had to get it done on time. So Barry had at least half to three-quarters of the score film finished before he wrote the theme that we know as Thunderball that Tom Jones sang. And he only did that because the producers were panicking because they wanted a theme song that had the name of the film in it, so that would help promote the movie. And I think Thunderball's okay as a song, but to me, it's nowhere near as good as Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, which just captures the feel of the film perfectly. So you have those two themes in the film, and absolutely great score. So I've seen the film. I stopped counting, and I don't do this anymore, so don't worry about it. I'm perfectly fine. But I stopped counting after 40 times, having seen the film 40 times in theaters.
No, that's great. I always feel very lucky when I find a movie that I actually want to rewatch. So it's really great that you found one.
Yeah, that's funny because Thunderball was, it's not a great movie. It really isn't. But I liked it, especially as a little kid. I was just a little kid. And one of the things that I like about especially the early Bond movies, and the Daniel Craig, the last one, I think is great too, but that's a separate issue. But what I like about them is that you could see it, and especially for the Connery ones, they had little things that we would now refer to as Easter eggs, I guess. Stuff that are hidden in the background, and sometimes things that were not hidden at all, but people didn't get them. And so if you see the movie over and over again, eventually you might get them. There's one thing in Thunderball that I have never found anywhere that anyone has ever understood. And it took me a long time to catch it. And that is, there's a scene where after the opening credits, he goes into a spa. In theory, I mean, the movie's based on a book, which is a long story, which I won't get into. But the book was not written entirely by Ian Fleming, so there was a lawsuit. And if you get early copies of the book, it'll say by Ian Fleming. If you get anything after the lawsuit, it'll say by Ian Fleming, based on a screenplay by Ian Fleming, Kevin McClory, and Jack Whittingham. So they finally settled the lawsuit, but in the book, it tells you a little more than it does in the movie. And he's in a spa to get shapes. He's in a health spa somewhere in France. And in the film, somebody from Spectre comes in, and Bond is on a machine they call the rack, and it's supposed to stretch him and be good for his back or something. So he's strapped down to this machine, and there's some goofy little dial on there that you can dial up to. Evidently, the machine was built so that it could be dangerous, which makes no sense. So this guy comes in and he puts it up to the red level so that the audience knows, well, it's in the red, so it has to be bad. And then Bond is being pulled at a very fast rate, pushed and pulled by a machine, and that he's strapped into, and he almost faints. And then to get back at the guy later, he goes into a different area of the spa. The guy's in this little enclosed cabinet with his head sticking out, and evidently it's a cabinet where there's heat. So he's sweating in this cabinet, and there's handles on the front, so that you can open the door. And this the kind of handles where you could put your fingers in and open it up, not a regular doorknob. And he takes a broom and evidently that has a red area too, where you could just turn the dial up to super heat.
Just the world's most unsafe health spa.
And he puts the broom handle through the doorknobs to sort of lock the guy in. The guy's like yelling at him, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" And Connery says, "Don't worry, I'll call the chef." And he leaves the area, and it says irrigation. Now, there was a thing in those days that most people maybe don't know anything about. It was called colonic irrigation. They would just shove water into you to cleanse you, and almost, I guess, like they have in Japanese toilets that to clean you. And Connery utters a line that was reminiscent of a song that was even old in those days, I think. And the expression was, "See you later, alligator." So Connery leaves and he says, "See you later, irrigator." So he's not saying alligator, he's saying irrigator. But nobody gets that. And in the translation, in the closed caption, it says alligator. And that's not what he was saying.
That's very funny. I'm going to have to find that and dig that up, because Fiona is a very recent convert to James Bond. When the coronavirus started, all of the movies were on one of the services we had, so she just started watching them, and she's worked through all of the old ones up to the modern ones, and she has a lot of affection for that. She's even branched out into stuff like The Prisoner or the Gary Anderson TV shows with the puppets. When you mentioned the steam cabinets, people go with their heads sticking out, it made me think of that, because there's an episode of The Prisoner that has a pretty good goof where he's in that, and then he emerges from it. When he opens the doors, he's wearing like a full suit and coat.
No, I think it's funny. You mentioned The Prisoner. That was another great one. Of course, I think it was Ron Grainer who did the theme to that. And I think they had several different versions before they chose what they used, which was a really nice piece of music for that one as well.
Oh, yeah.
And that was Patrick McGowan. And it came right after the series he did, which in England was called Danger Man, and Secret Agent Man. It was a name in the United States. But that was another good...
Patrick McGowan is great. Like, whenever he shows up in something, it's always a treat. Like the scientist in Scanners, or, in an episode of Columbo or something. It's always like, oh, yay, there he is.
Yeah, I think he did maybe 4 episodes of Columbo, and I think he directed all of them. And he was a really good director, too, because those were good episodes he did. One in Columbo. One, he was a spy. One, he was a funeral director. I forget what he was in the others, but he directed them, and he was a really good director. And it was because he made it really interesting. But of course, if you have a TV show, and this is what they made you do, and in those days, you didn't have a great budget for TV shows, and you had to make the most of everything. So they had to have really good writers, because you couldn't waste time, and they had to have good actors because you couldn't waste time. You had to film on a schedule. And you had to get a lot more done per day than you would if it had been a motion picture, a regular feature film. And so they learned a lot of discipline, and they learned a lot of techniques. For example, how to light a set. Because no matter what you do, when you make a movie, you have to put big lights up and reflectors if it's going to be outside, and that reflects the sun on people. And so you have the DP, which is the director of photography. And he usually knows what type of look he wants or she wants, and they have it set up, and they take a lot of time. That takes a lot of time for professional filmmakers to set up the lighting. That takes an awful lot of time, but they can't afford that time in television. So you'll notice that the lighting is not quite as it can't be, and it isn't as artistic in television as it is in feature films. So they have to just use economics, when they make their TV productions. But then you have people like Hitchcock who wanted to do something different. I think the last film he made before he did Psycho was North by Northwest. That was a very big hit. Cary Grant, big color production, giant hit. It was sort of like a light comedy / spy suspense thriller, but it was a really good film, a lot of fun. The next film he wanted to do was based on a serial killer. And the studios just had no sense of humor, so they didn't think that was funny. And they didn't know, but they didn't want to put the money into it. He wanted to make a movie about Ed Gein, who was, they made Texas Chainsaw Massacre after him, and he was just a serial killer, and he would cut people's face off and put it on as a mask. And so that's what Psycho was based on. It was based on that story. It was based on a book by Robert Bloch. And then I think I don't remember the guy who wrote the screenplay offhand. It'll come to me. I'll think about it. But Hitchcock put his own money into it because nobody else would. And he had to actually, I think he mortgaged his house to put money up for Psycho. And because his wife gave him permission because she was a very big part of his movie making. Alma Reville was her name. And he consulted her about everything. She never really got the credit she deserved, but she really was a large part of everything he did. So they took a big chance on doing Psycho, and it paid off really, really well. But one of the reasons they did it the way they did it was because Hitchcock had learned from his TV show, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, which later became the Alfred Hitchcock Hour, but it was only really good as a half-hour show.
Oh, yeah.
But that he learned from that how to the economy of filming for television, so that he could do that in like maybe I think he filmed that movie in a month or so. What didn't take him very long at all, and everything was done as if it would be for television. So they didn't have the luxury of as much time making it as they would have had for Vertigo or North by Northwest or later films even. So that was something that's very interesting too. At least it was.
No, I love Psycho, and I enjoy learning about it, how it was made, because it was such a unique production. Even just the decision to follow up this full color, like very bombastic tentpole film with like this very pared down black and white horror thriller that has a giant swerve halfway through. And for it to be one of those times where it comes out successful on top of that, like, it makes me really happy because it's a really good movie.
Yeah. Well, I like the idea that Hitchcock always throughout his whole life experimented. He didn't do the same thing the same way all the time. He would do different things, and he wouldn't make it so that you knew what to expect, because that's boring. Why you don't want to. One of the things that people do in the movie business that I think is a big mistake is they take a look at what's being made and they say, oh, well, this is popular. Let's make this because this is popular. So they'll see, for example, after a while, or I could start with Star Wars if you want. I mean, before Star Wars, science fiction films were always low budget. And that was sort of the first larger budget science fiction film. And the reason it became popular is a separate issue from the reason people copied it. They copied Star Wars after it came out, and you had all these people, trying to make large science fiction movies or outer space films, especially because Star Wars was popular. So they said, oh, well, it's popular because what is it? Oh, it's a science fiction film in outer space where people are fighting each other. Okay, that's what's popular. No, that's not what was popular. What was popular was introducing a new concept that someone hadn't done before. It turns out this new concept was about space and fighting in space, but that's not what made it popular. What made it popular was that it was a fresh idea when it was released. When you start copying that, it's no longer a fresh idea. And so, unfortunately, people with talent, if you want to call it, in the area of finances, rarely, if ever, have talent in the area of talent. Creativity. They don't really know what they're doing. They're just banksters.
Definitely, because like you said, now everything is just so risk averse. Like, that's kind of the life cycle of a lot of modern directors, is they'll make something small that's critically acclaimed, then they'll get, bought up by Disney to make a Marvel movie or something, and it looks and sounds like every other Marvel movie, but at least they make a bunch of money off of it, and then after that, maybe they go off and make some more interesting stuff again. But the days of someone working up to get something new and unique from the studios, or even like the old Martin Scorsese one for you, one for me thing, I feel like it doesn't really happen as much anymore, and that's kind of sad. Even if on the bright side, low budget stuff is way more accessible now than it used to be.
Yeah, I think that's true. And it's unfortunate, but there's some people like Jim Jarmusch who put out some really interesting films, and then Hollywood wanted him to do some movies for them, and he didn't. He knew what would happen if he did, so he just didn't agree to that. And then you have people like David Lynch, who probably had the best of both worlds, because his first film, Eraserhead, was a very dark comedy, really dark comedy. And when he was asked about it, he said it was about his experience in the city of Philadelphia. And then he did these other films, which were really, really creative, with at least two exceptions. But one of the exceptions was his version of Dune, which I thought could have been great, could have been wonderful if they didn't have any translation of any kind whatsoever and had no dialogue, or either had no dialogue or had dialogue in an imaginary language that they didn't bother to translate, because the dialogue ruined the entire film, in my mind. But then that was a big budget one, and he didn't have he didn't have all the control over that, I think. But then his later film, I think Blue Velvet was a really good film. And I think that, what's the one in Hollywood? What's that one that he did?
Mulholland Drive?
Yeah, I love that. I think that's probably one of his best.
Yeah, no, I love David Lynch. When you were talking about how the 50s were scary, it actually made me think of a lot of his work, and especially Blue Velvet, which is kind of like the perfect version of that whole, the ugliness lurking right beneath the surface of 50s suburbia.
Yeah, well, Blue Velvet, Blue Velvet is one of his greatest too. Just finding an ear at random and then have, that was a great film. He's done some really good stuff, and people who don't understand his movies, I have some friends who don't understand his movies, and I've said to them, look at it again. Don't expect that you're looking at a regular film, because you're not. Look at it again and imagine that somebody was able to film his own dreams and that he's having a nightmare. Just look at it that way.
Yeah, no, that's really frustrating, because his movies can operate on dream logic or just pure emotion, but they do make sense, and it makes me really really sad whenever people watch it and just say, oh, he's just being weird for weirdness' sake. He's just making it up. You're just faking it because you want to look like you're sophisticated. Like, his movies really connect with me in a way that very few others do. You just have to be tuned into their wavelength.
Yeah, that's a great way of phrasing it. That's a really good way of phrasing it, because that's true. I don't think I could have put it better, but that's exactly right. And I think he has an incredible amount of talent. I just wish he would be making more movies.
We did at least get Twin Peaks: The Return, where he was allowed to come back and direct a new season with zero oversight, and it was wonderful. Just probably my favorite piece of television ever.
Yeah, and I would also have to give credit to Angelo Badalamenti for doing the scores, because his stuff is really good too. This guy's a really good composer. I think he's probably underrated, because I don't think he's got the credit he deserves, but he's really good.
He really is. And there were even a couple of times where he's popped up in other stuff that was made by people who are obviously inspired by or influenced by David Lynch, and wanted to have him on to kind of try and capture some of that atmosphere. But I feel like maybe the material doesn't always rise up to his level. When he's working on something that's good, he almost always just does an absolute home run soundtrack. All of his David Lynch stuff is so good.
Yeah, I think the best way for a composer to operate, and I had a discussion with John Barry about this years ago, is when you can find either a producer or director, whomever hires you and whomever you're working with, to not micromanage, just to get off your back and let you do your job. If you hire somebody, you should hire somebody because you like the way they work and you think they can do the job. Once you do that, leave them the hell alone. don't be looking over their shoulder. It doesn't work. And I know Barry's done I think way over 50 movies. He's done a lot of really obscure films that he's done, to my mind, really fantastic music for, and the films didn't deserve it. And in many cases, they threw out his score because they're dumb. They had really dumb people making these movies. And he was nice enough to do it for them. And they just there's one of the examples is a movie called First Love. And you after, I don't know how many years, you could now get a CD with his music on there from First Love. And he had said that they threw out the score because they thought it was too mature for their movie. Well, they were honest, at least.
Yeah, I guess so.
I mean, but if you listen to me, and then he did a great score to some movies that are very, maybe not worthy of the great scores, but there's a film he did called Ruby Cairo, and that was in the 80s, I think. And that was a really good score. Just not something that people know about, but you can get the CD. I think that exists.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite mismatched John Barry scores is the one for The Black Hole. I don't know if you're familiar with that or not.
Of course I am, yeah.
Yeah, because that waltz, that slow theme that he uses for the movie is very haunting and atmospheric. It's very good, even if I'm not a big fan of the movie itself.
No, well, there's a Disney movie. I think it was the first and only Disney movie he ever did. It was also the first time a score was recorded digitally. Huh. It was the first digital film score. And it was that sweeping waltz rhythm because, that was the swirl of falling into the black hole. So it would go da 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 da. Yes. And then they had this great music behind that. But even with that one, they asked him to copy the fanfare from Star Wars. So he did his own version of that as another piece of music in the film. That da 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 da. That.
Oh yeah, the opening title fanfare.
Yeah, then it went into the black hole theme. But he did. It was a great job, of course.
Oh yeah. Last time I talked to you, you mentioned getting to interview John Barry, and I thought that might be kind of a good segue because in your past, you yourself are actually an interviewer, and you got to interview all these sort of big figures of classic Hollywood, and those all seem like really interesting stories. So I guess I'd like to know how did you come about getting to interview John Barry?
Oh yeah, well, what I did was I was in college, and I joined the college newspaper staff because it's easy for me to be a writer. That was, I have no problems figuring out how to say what's on my mind. I have no problems knowing what's on my mind. And I figured, well, there are people that I want to interview just simply because I love their work. And I think that their stuff is really great. And so I wanted to meet them. And I knew that I couldn't just say, can I meet you? Because I'm just this college student, and they would be, I knew they'd have to justify in their own heads to themselves why they would be spending time with a college student. So I decided to use the newspaper as a means to give them a reason to justify allowing me to meet with them so I could interview them. So I would interview them for the college paper. And then after that, after I was graduated from college, I continued writing for different newspapers. I mean, at the beginning of my work life, and continued interviewing different celebrities. But between college and after, I've interviewed John Barry, Lily Tomlin, Patrick McNee, Jack Lemmon, Gene Roddenberry, Isaac Asimov, Count Basie, Sean Connery. Well, I didn't interview Sean. I can tell you the story about that, but I was on the set of Are Forever. I was on the set of 2 Bond movies, Diamonds Are Forever and Spy Who Loved Me, and the set of an Alfred Hitchcock movie, Frenzy, his next to the last film he made, which I think is a great and underrated film. So there's a whole bunch of famous people that I interviewed, and I don't remember offhand every last one of them. Peter Nero, most of Monty Python, except for John Cleese. And the only reason I didn't interview John Cleese was because I was in London for a certain period of time, and he was willing to be interviewed, but he didn't we couldn't coordinate the schedule because I was going to be gone when he had time to be interviewed. But I interviewed the rest of them, and a near interview with Harrison Ford, I spoke with him, but he didn't have enough time to do an interview. I don't know, maybe a bunch of others whose names I'm probably forgetting.
I definitely agree. Like, obviously my podcast doesn't carry as much weight as like an actual publication, but just having that as an excuse to reach out to people has been fantastic. I've met a lot of really interesting people already. Like, one is a game designer and another is a local stand-up comedian. You know, having the opportunity to meet people that you admire is great. And there is that sort of first road speed bump of having to overcome that instinct to not bother people. But once you do, like, worst case scenario is that they say no, and more often than not, they will. They'll accept it. That means we get to have a great conversation like we're having right now. And I really appreciate how nice and supportive you've been. And just every conversation I've had with you so far has been a joy.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you to say. Excuse me. The first person that I interviewed was John Barry, and I was a kid. I wasn't not an adult, and I had read that he was going to be. I was in college, and I read that he was going to be in town working on a play, a musical, and of course he was. Again, in those days he lived in England, York, England, and he came to work on a musical. With Alan J. Lerner. And I figured, oh, great, he's going to be in town, so I could interview him. And this is before the internet. This is before any, you have to imagine no internet, which I know it's the internet is so addicting. It's so convenient that it's difficult to imagine how we would do things with no internet. But I had to be very creative. So I had to figure out which stage he was going to be at, because they had a few theaters. And I had to figure out which theater he was going to be at. And then it was a Schubert theater. And what they had in those days is they had payphones backstage. And that was called the backstage number. So they'd have a phone number of a payphone. Now, normally, if people don't know what payphones are these days, they were telephones you put money in to make calls because nobody had cell phones because they hadn't been invented. So it'd be kind of difficult to use them if they had them because they hadn't been invented. So you had payphones. In those days, you usually used payphones to make outgoing calls. And I don't mean outgoing in the sense of friendly, but whatever, but just calls going out from that phone. You didn't use them usually for incoming calls, but they did have a phone number so that if you knew that phone number, you could have somebody call you. So you didn't have to have change to put into the telephone to pay for the call. Somebody could just call you from their phone. And the backstage phone number was a payphone, which was used mostly, you could call out from it if you wanted, but it was used mostly to receive calls backstage. And if that was never made public, that information, what that number would be, was never made public. But they always had a regular phone number that you could call for the box office. And anyone who knew enough to ask for a backstage phone number, they didn't even question you at the box office. They would just give you that number because they would figure, well, the general public's not going to know what that is. So if someone's asking for a backstage phone number, they must deserve it. So I called and I asked for the backstage phone number and they gave it to me. And I called that and I asked to speak to John Barry. And once again, if the backstage phone rings, then people assume that it's somebody who should be calling that number. So if they ask for John Barry, they'll get John Barry. So they put him on the phone and I introduced myself and I told him I was just interested in interviewing him for my college paper. And he said, okay, I'll do that, but I'm really busy now, and why don't you give me a call? I can't set anything up now. Just give me a call back in an hour. And basically what happened, I'll cut the story short, is he was busy. He was telling me the truth. He was very busy. And he couldn't figure out when he would have time to arrange an interview. And he kept putting it off and telling me to call him back. And then he finally said, I'll tell you what, I'll call you back in 2 hours. And so I gave him my number and I waited 2 hours and he didn't call me back. I waited 2.5 hours. He didn't call me back. So I'm at a crossroads. I'm thinking to myself, do I not call him back and miss the opportunity, or possibly miss the opportunity to interview my favorite composer? Or do I call him back and possibly annoy my favorite composer and have him hate me? So I didn't, they were not the greatest alternatives, but I figured, well, if he ended up being annoyed by me calling him back, he'd probably get over it. I might not, but he would. And I don't think it would be as easy for me to get over thinking what it would have been like if I had put the effort into calling him. And if he had said no, if he had said, I don't have the time or I can't do it, then I would have said, okay, I appreciate that and thank you anyway. And that would have been that. But he never said no. He said yes. So I called him back. And I got him, and this continued for a little while. And then they said, listen, we have to take the show. We're going to New York for a week before we take it elsewhere to work on it. And I'm going to be at the Carlisle Hotel. This is a nice hotel. Why don't you just give me a call there? Because he initially said that I'm going to be in New York and I won't, I guess we won't be able to do it. And I said, well, I can go to New York. It's not a big deal. I said, I'll go there if that's okay with you. He said, sure, just give me a call. I'll be at the Carlisle Hotel. So I found out their phone number and gave them a call. And we arranged it, and it was for a certain Saturday at 10 in the morning. And I took a train to New York, and I got there, and they had these wonderful marble floors. I mean, the Carlisle Hotel is just it's a very old hotel in New York, and it's like all kinds of famous people stay there. I didn't know that at the time, but royalty stays there and all kinds of famous people stay there. Woody Allen used to perform there before he became naughty and
before the troubles.
Yeah. It's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, I know I haven't really talked about what my regular show is, but that is a topic that does come up a lot, so we have developed some kind of fun shorthand for it. This is a little different than what we usually cover, but I'd like to think that my audience will still get some enjoyment from this, because I know I am.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And but it's just a really nice hotel, and I got there, and they have these little, at least at the time, I don't know that they've changed it. I don't know why they would, but they had these tables in the lobby. Well, maybe they would have changed it because they don't need this anymore. But they had like tables right near the elevators, and marble little circular tables that were on a pole, and on the top of the table was a telephone, and that was connected to, I guess they wouldn't have it now. Now that I'm thinking about it, actually, they wouldn't have it. They used to have telephone operators at in the hotels, and then you would pick up the phone, it would immediately go to an operator. They would say, what room, please? And you would either tell them the room number or the name of the person. They wouldn't give out the room number if you didn't know it, because that's a violation of privacy, but they would connect you. So I was there, and I called John Barry exactly at 10 o'clock, and a woman answers the phone, a very nice sounding woman, and she said, hello. And I told her who I was and why I was there. And she said, oh, I'm terribly sorry, but John's had a pretty rough night and he's sleeping. So I'm faced with another dilemma. I said, okay. I said, listen, I don't mean to be rude in any way, but I have been trying for a very long time to get an interview with him. He said, be here at 10 o'clock on Saturday. I came, I had to take a train to get here. It was a several-hour journey, and I would never have been here unless John was going to be willing to give me the interview. That's the only reason I'm here. I don't mean to be a pest. I really don't, but I'm here for the interview. And she said, okay, just hang on. And then she put me on hold, and then a minute or two later said, okay, wait 10 minutes and then come up. So I waited 10 minutes, and then I took the elevator up, and he had this great suite that he was staying at. It had 2 levels to it. He had
wow.
There's a staircase to the upper level, and I came in on the lower level, and the lower level had a library and a piano and tape recording machines. In those days, they were big reel-to-reel tapes. And and Barry was very nice. He opened up the door and he asked me how my ride was. And he was very friendly and he invited me in and I sat down. I never met the woman. I heard her voice. It was disembodied. I never met her. But I know she made me, he asked if I wanted any coffee. And I said, well, sure, thank you. And they gave me like gingerbread cookies with it. and he was very nice. I got the interview with him, but to sort of prove to the people, and for a souvenir as well, for both a souvenir and to prove to the people who read my article in my college paper, that I actually interviewed the people that I said I was interviewing. And this is way before Photoshop, but I would always have a picture of me with that person. So I had a Polaroid camera, and there was a desk not too far from the couch where I was interviewing John Barry, and I put the camera. I asked if hopefully that woman would be willing to take a picture of me standing next to John Barry, but he said, "Well, she's not dressed," and I was going to say it's okay, but I didn't. So instead, what I did was I don't know why, but I had the foresight to bring a self-timer, which is a little device you could wind up and stick on the Polaroid on the top of the thing where you just press the button to take a picture, and it would delay pressing the button for about 20 seconds. So I focused it on John Barry sitting on the couch, and I sat next to him, and it took a picture. So that was my experience with John Barry, and it taught me a very important lesson, which is to be polite, to be fair, to be decent to people. But if they don't say no, then it's not a no. If they say yes, rather, it's not a no. If they don't say anything, you don't know what it is. But if they say yes, I'll do the interview, then it's a yes. So it taught me to be persistent, but not, hopefully not annoying. I mean, I didn't want to do that.
That was a great story and some really good advice. I'm happy to hear it.
Yeah, well, I used that actually. They had in those days when you interviewed anybody, they would usually ask you for what they called a clipping, which is just a copy of the article once it was printed in a paper. So you just cut that out and send it to them. And it's usually because they had publicity people working for them. They wanted to keep track of whatever kind of publicity they were getting. And so I would actually use that interview to get another interview, to get the next interview, which I don't remember if the next was Jack Lemmon or Lily Tomlin, but I mean, that's what I would do. And then I would use those to get other interviews afterwards. So that would establish my credentials. And then one day somebody told me that there was somebody in town who was looking, that might be an interesting article to write about. And they were looking in comedy clubs for comedians to put in a movie that they were going to be making. So I figured this is great. I'll go down there and interview them about their movie. And it was a comedy movie. And I said, by the way, do you have anybody writing the theme song to your movie? Or do you have a theme song? Or do you want a theme song? And they said, well, we don't have anybody doing music at all because we haven't even started yet. And I said, well, if I wrote a song that you like, would you use it? And they said, sure, why not? So I went home. After I interviewed them, I did an article about them, but I went home and I took a hot bath, which is, where I usually do a lot of meditating. And the whole song came into my head all at once. And I went to the piano to find, to figure out how to play it. And I wrote preliminary lyrics to it and went to their house. They happened to have a piano there too. And I just played it for them. And they said they loved it. I don't know why they would lie to me, but they said they loved it. And then they said, well, why don't you do the whole score to the film? And I said, well, I don't have any official background in music. I don't know how to write musical notation. I have no specific official knowledge in it. So I would need someone else to arrange my music, but I could certainly compose it. And I would certainly be able to tell them, what types of instruments it would be that I would like to use if possible. So if you want to do it that way, fine. So they did. And I noticed that when I would, in those days, we would record things on a cassette tape recorder. And I would record the themes. I would write stuff like there was various themes for that first film, and I wrote them and played them and recorded them on a cassette, and so it was really easy to hear the melody and the counter melody and the chords or whatever, however I was doing it. And I noticed that the guy who was arranging the music, who had a very good background in music, he had been highly educated, but he was dealing with a bunch of studio musicians, and studio musicians are really, really sharp. I mean, these guys are fantastic. They pick stuff up by ear. So if they hear something, they know how to play it immediately. Even if they can read music, they usually don't, because they don't need to. They'll pick it up right away. And so all he was doing was playing my music for them. And I could have done that. So after the first film, I hired my own studio musicians, and I did all the arranging myself. And the only thing else I made one mistake, and that was when I did a documentary, feature film documentary about Muhammad Ali, which is a really odd thing for me to do, since I think boxing is idiotic. But if you like it, fine. But I think it's idiotic anyway. I'm not saying people who like it are idiotic. However, I did the music to that, and then I hired. I needed some extra musicians for an additional piece that they needed. So I hired a few from an orchestra. So they were orchestral musicians. And that was a mistake, because orchestral musicians, although they're extremely talented, they're talented at immediately sight reading something. So you could put it on, if you have it on notation paper, they can play it, and that's how they do these things. But they're not studio musicians. They're not session musicians. They don't work like that. So that was a big problem, because it wasn't written out, and he had to figure out how to play it. But I learned, and that's how I got started.
No, that was really interesting, especially given the time period.
Well, thank you.
So now we know how your film composing started. I guess since your record is how I found you, I guess I'd like to know how did you go about getting these record deals? Like with Godzilla versus Your Mother, how did creating that and getting a label to put it out and everything work? Like, I did a little research, and I saw that the label that put it out is actually the one owned by The Resident. So if there's any interesting stories about that, I would love to hear it.
Okay. Yeah, it might be interesting, but let me put it this way. Okay, so the third film I scored, the first film I scored was a comedy. It never got released. It was actually not that bad. It's probably one of my better scores. It was called Satisfaction Guaranteed, but it never got released. The second one was the Muhammad Ali documentary feature film. And the third was The Deadly Spawn. And that's the film that led me into the answer to your question. So what I will do is tell you what happened there.
I would love to, because Deadly Spawn actually has a bit of an online following today among like 80s horror fans and stuff. There's a popular YouTube channel that actually did a video about it that introduced a lot of people to it, including myself. So finding out that you made that was really cool, because I was like, oh, I know about that. And getting to watch the movie with that knowledge added a lot to it. Yeah,
thank you. Well, so I had done I was hired to do the score to Deadly Spawn, and I had the agreement in my contract that I owned all the rights to my music, and including the publishing rights and the right to put it out on soundtrack album, and use their official artwork for the cover if I wanted, etc. So at that point, I had no records released. I hadn't had any records released, and I wanted to get my first record released for The Deadly Spawn. And the guy who did the poster art was Tim Hildebrand, and he's the guy who did Star Wars poster art. And before that, he and his brother Greg are known for having done Lord of the Rings calendars, and their artwork was really cool. It was really good, and it was pretty distinctive. And I figured, well, I've got this great artwork. I'm gonna use that, because first of all, I like it. That's the real reason I'm using it. But the next reason I'm using it is because it's Tim Hildebrand, and it was the original artwork for the film, and why not? So I'm trying to find a record label to put it out. And I've got one company wanted to come into existence, wanted me to give them a 6-month option to find the money to start their company and put the record out. I should not have done it, but I did. I tried because they were nice people, and I figured, well, okay, I'll let them do that. So my hands were tied for 6 months. So I couldn't look for another label because they had 6 months to come up with the money. At the end of 6 months, they were unable to do that. And they wanted an extension for another 6 months. And I said, well, no. I said, listen, I appreciate it. And it's very nice, but I won't do that because I gave you 6 months. That's what you said you needed. You couldn't do it in 6 months. And now you're coming to me with the same exact deal. I know now that you can't raise money for this project in 6 months. I'm not going to renew this. So, and no offense, and I thanked them and all that, but so I started looking for a new label. So somebody told me about Ralph Records, and they're the home of the Residents. And the Residents is this group that used to go around I don't think they advertised at all, except maybe posters for when they were performing. They would perform around the world, and they would be dressed in there were 4 of them, and they'd be dressed in tuxedos, and over their heads, covering their heads, would be a giant eyeball, and on top of the eyeball would be a top hat, and that was their trademark. And they were on a record label that was invented for them. It was called Ralph Records. Ralph is in, So one of the producers, one of the owners of the company, he came to, I contacted him, and he loved the music from Deadly Spawn, but he wanted to have some time to figure out whether or not he wanted to put it out on their label. So I said, okay, but I'm not gonna wait 6 months or anything. I said, if you don't want to put out Deadly Spawn immediately, then I'm going to look for another label. So I found a company who I forget the name of the company, but it was they put out strictly Broadway shows. So they put out Broadway musicals on their record label. And for some reason, the guy actually liked my music. And so he said, but he can't put it out on their label because that label was associated with Broadway shows. So he wanted me to create a label name. So I said, well, let's be really creative and call it Deadly Records, which was being quasi almost humorous. So, but we did. We called it Deadly Records because what else are you going to call it? And he put it out on that. And I said, listen, I think it would be kind of funny just to be, it's just my sense of humor to make it look like it's a bootleg by not having any address or any place to write to or saying who manufactured it or anything, just, So the first version of Deadly Spawn that came out on vinyl with really great artwork from Tim Hildebrand. And that then after I made that agreement, then Ralph Records got back to me and said, yeah, we want to put out Deadly Spawn. And I said, well, that would be great, except I already made the deal to put out Deadly Spawn. I said, how about if you put out my next film score, whatever that is? And they said, okay, if we like it, we'll have to hear it first. We're not going to agree to put it out unless we like the music. I said, well, that's fair enough. So I was going to do a score to a movie. I don't think I should mention the name. I actually did the score to this movie. And I don't want to give away too much, but I'll just say this. It was a horror film. And it was a score to that film. But the producers of the film never paid me for it. And they kept putting me off, saying that, there's not enough music. And, we need more music. And I did basically two albums worth of stuff for them. And there was plenty of music, and it fit the scenes. I gave them like alternate versions of what would fit different scenes. And I always would tell them which one I think they should use. And they kept putting me off. And so I finally wrote a letter to them saying, listen, I'm going to give you 2 weeks. If you don't pay me what you owe me in 2 weeks, you do not use my music, and I will never work for you again. That'll be that. And I guarantee you that if they would have paid me one day after 2 weeks, I would have refused the money and never worked for them again. They did not pay. And so I told them not to use the music. So the music was withdrawn from that project. But I had this whole big film score that I had done. I mean, not big in terms of money, but big in terms of what I put into it. And I just figured, well, let's get it out anyway, because I liked it. It was really quirky. It was really, I mean, it's not music that most people would like. I understand this, and like most people would just turn it off or yell at you if you had it on at a party. They'd say, "What's that crap? Turn that off." I understand that, but it fit the film I did very, very well. And so I just figured, let's put it out on a record album. So I contacted the guy at Ralph Records, Tom is his name. And I said, Tom, I know, you said you put out the next album. I said, well, if you like the music, you'd put out the next score from the next movie. And I had been sending him copies of it at the same time. So he already liked the music. And I said, well, I'm not using it in that film because they didn't pay me. And I said, I'm not going to work for them ever, which I didn't and wouldn't. And I said, but let's put it out. And I said, here's some ideas. We can put it out as the original score to that film. But the problem with that is I don't want to give that film any publicity. Or we could put it out, and I've got, I designed the cover, and I got some person that I knew to paint the cover art. And it didn't come out exactly as I wanted, because it was supposed to be this giant lizard that's obviously larger than these buildings, and this giant woman who is larger than the buildings. And I wanted to make sure that she kicked the lizard right in the lizard, and just to make sure that was clear what was happening. And anyway, I said so. I gave him the artwork, and he said, well, we have a company called Pornographics, and they kept spelling the name differently. So one time it would be Pourno graphics, and another time it would be Poorknow, but it would be Pornographics. And but in those days they had a very difficult, or it would be expensive to do what they called full color art, which is 4-color separation. So you'd have one negative for magenta, one for cyan, one for yellow, one for black and white. And it was just more expensive than doing it the way they did it. The way they did it was artistic and interesting. However, it was cheap. It was not very expensive. And I already knew what I wanted for the cover art for this, because that was going to be my second record album. And, I didn't want it to look drastically worse than the one for Deadly Spawn. So I wanted this to be extraordinarily colorful and bizarre. If it's not bizarre, then I have no interest in it. So it was bizarre enough, I think. And I made a deal with somebody in England to do the color separation. And so I said to Ralph Records, I said, well, I'll take care of that part. You'll get the 4-color separation done. And but the question is, what do we call it? I had 2 titles for them. One of them was Godzilla versus Your Mother, and the other was The Lizard of Oz. and I said, I think we should call it The Lizard of Oz, though, because I like Godzilla versus Your Mother, but I don't know what Toho Studios would say about that, and I don't know if we're allowed to do that. It's a parody, so I think technically we are, but who knows, what they would do or how they react. And he said, well, I like Godzilla versus Your Mother. Let's release it like that. I said, okay. So they released it like that. And he says, well, Toho will never find out about it. So People Magazine, meanwhile, does a review on it. And of course, the review is awful. I mean, when I say the review is awful, I don't mean it was poorly written. I mean, what they thought of my stuff. They thought my music was awful. But the reason they thought it was awful is because they were expecting a comedy album. Although it says clearly on the album, it says from the as yet to be made film, and it was an instrumental, as you know, from an actual film. So it got this really bad review, and then because it was in People and Toho Studios found out about it, and they wrote to Ralph Records threatening a lawsuit if they didn't withdraw the album. And I said, well, let them. If they sue us, that's great, because then let's just think of all the great publicity, like Godzilla versus this tiny record company. So we get a lot of publicity. And he said,
Godzilla versus Godzilla versus your mother.
Or Godzilla versus Ralph Records, this tiny record company. And so I said, well, that's great, isn't it? And he said, well, who's going to pay for the lawyers? And I said, well, I'm not. So he had to pull it out of all the record stores. Of course, some of them had already been sold, I guess, and I don't know what he did with others, but he wasn't allowed to sell them. So he pulled them all out, and I think we would have won that lawsuit based on fair use, and because it's clearly a parody, and it's just on the front was the word Godzilla. It's like you can't say you can't use a word, but in any case, that's what happened with it. And then later on, there was a producer who did this really low budget film called Winter Beast, and he wanted me to do the score to it, but he didn't have any money. So I said, well, let's make a deal. You'll give me a percentage of the income for the film. I know enough not to do a net deal. You don't get a percentage of the net.
Yeah, always take the gross, not the net.
Yeah, you make a deal for whatever percent of the gross. So he said, okay. And he liked the music, and he cut it in. And I had more, and I gave him more of the tapes. I don't have them now. I don't know where. I moved a few times, so I have no idea where some of this stuff is. I have some, and I don't have others. But I gave but basically the most of the music in Winter Beast is from the record, and the rest is from the same project, but it wasn't on the record. And that's the story of how that came to be used in that film.
That adds a lot, because I was going to say Toho is pretty infamously litigious. Like, even now on YouTube, like, people who do videos about Godzilla will have their accounts get copyright strikes, even without using the footage, just because Toho is so protective of their intellectual property. They're still very litigious about the Godzilla name, so I guess I should consider myself very fortunate that I even found the record then. That's very fascinating.
Yeah, what I really would have preferred is, and I told him at the time, I still think it would have been funnier if they called it The Lizard of Roz. And it would just so it had the storyline about this woman being kicked off her planet for having a very loud party, and we could have just said her name was Roz.
I totally get that. You'd hoped if they were the ones who picked up the name, they'd be willing to stand up for it, but unfortunately, it doesn't always work out.
So that's the story for that one. And then I did. So Ralph Records, they also put out some of my other stuff, but they started other labels. So when it was a CD, when he formed the CD, he had two different labels for the CDs. Tectones and Episode, and one of them put out Hollywood Chainsaw Hookers and other film scores of mine, and the other one put out Where Evil Lives, which was a different film score. And but my first CD was a concept album called Elephants Gliding on Ice, and I don't know, have you heard any of that or not?
I haven't. I wasn't able to find it online when I looked around.
Yeah, it was out by a record company in Canada called Dove, and they put out these always these obscure people, like Zoviet France was one of them. Nurse with Wound was another. And anyway, Dove stood for Death of Vinyl Entertainment.
That's really good.
But some of that music is on The Least Worst.
I'm very thankful you sent that to me, because I've listened to it a couple times, and I'm always happy to have more of your music, but especially some of the more recent stuff that came out after Godzilla versus your mother.
Well, thank you. So anyway, that was another. I like that was like the Elephants Gliding on Ice was one of my favorites, I think. But do you have other questions? Did you read the liner notes or any of that stuff?
Yes, thank you. I'm glad you mentioned that because I wanted to talk about it. I actually wound up taking pictures of it and sending it to my friend who found the record and some other people. All of it, the comic, and like I said, I like your sense of humor and I like your style of writing, so it was very fun to flip through all those. Or even like the CD itself, like on the label, there's the little warning, and it says "Warning: Do not freeze," and then parentheses, it's "I mean you. Put on a sweater." Was just that was funny on a bunch of levels, and I really liked it.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Well, this is kind of a repeat, but last time I talked to you, you told me that story about how you found your records on sale in Amsterdam, and I thought that stuck with me. So I thought it might be fun to have it on mic here.
Yeah. So, well, so it was the first time I'd been to Amsterdam, and it was shortly after both of my record albums had been released, and I'm just walking along, and there's this big area in Amsterdam called the Dam Square. And there's a giant department store called Die Bankorp, and there's on one side, and then there's the Grand Cosmopolski Hotel on another, and there's a street that goes off on an angle called the Kalverstraat, which is Dutch for walking street, and it's closed to pedestrians. I mean, it's closed for pedestrians. It's closed to traffic, so that only pedestrians can. They don't have to worry about being hit by a car or something like that. But if you go down that street, at least when I did, at least in that at that time, there was you would have to notice shortly after you start walking down that street, there's half a Volkswagen coming out of the second story building, not out of a window, but it's like attached to the bricks coming out. And so that was put there to get your attention to go into the store and shop. But I figured anybody's going to put that effort into it. They deserve some of my business. I don't care. Even if it's a crappy store, I'll still go in there. So I went in there, and it turns out to be a clothing store, and they just had, mostly clothes. And the only clothes I saw there that I could buy, because I didn't really feel like I'm not a big clothes person at all, but they had blue suede shoes, and I figured, well, I've never seen them before in my life, and I'll probably never see them again in my life, and that's true. I never have so far, and so I figured I'd buy them. I think it'd be interesting to own a pair of blue suede shoes, so I bought them. Then I noticed they had a few boxes, cardboard boxes, like 2 or 3, not too many, of records, of vinyl LP records. And so I went through them, and one of them was a soundtracks, and that's kind of unusual because that was never a big thing for most people. So I went through the soundtracks, and I found both of my records there, both the Deadly Spawn and Godzilla versus Your Mother, and I think that was that made me really happy. I mean, and it was only, I think they only had like 1 or 2 copies of each or whatever, but I just thought it was great that it was there, because I had no idea it would be there. And it was fun. You're just going to a great city. Amsterdam's a wonderful town, and the people there are very friendly. They're good people. They're not screwed up. And just going anywhere where you have people that are not screwed up is nice, So it was a very happy experience for me.
I really like that, especially the parallel of how I found your record at a sort of a media show down here in Florida, of all places.
Yeah, well, you would have thought that, especially in Florida, they would have taken my albums and fed them to the alligators. But I guess you don't want to harm the alligators, and that's a good thing, not to harm them.
Yeah, we throw it to the alligators, and they just throw it right back, like, no, thank you.
they'd start learning how to talk, and they'd say, "Who the hell do you think you are?" Oh, by the way, speaking of which, the one thing missing on the cover of The Least Worst Of, you know what the cover looks like, right?
Yeah.
Okay. What I wanted, that the record company wouldn't do this. They didn't want to do this, but I figured it would be funny. And what I really wanted, one other thing that they didn't put on there, which was a sound bubble, or whatever you call it. If you have a comic and you have a balloon or sound bubble where somebody's saying something, and they put in this thing that has a point at the bottom, right?
Yeah.
So I wanted there to be something that like was coming from planet Earth. It was a dialogue bubble that was attached to planet Earth. It was in all capital letters. It would say, "And stay out." I just thought that would have been funny.
That is very funny.
They didn't want to do that. So anyway, I've got let's see what else. You can talk about anything you want, so you can ask me whatever you like.
Great. Well, I want to say alligators might not like your music, but rats certainly do. I have a couple pet rats, and I was playing with them when your album was playing the other night, and they were kind of bobbing and weaving with it, and they seem to be having a good time.
I don't know quite how to take that, but I'll take it as a compliment.
I love rats, especially at least the ones that are tame ones. They're very sweet little creatures.
So. Well, because I think it's a good idea to take everything as a compliment. Because if somebody, even if I'm not anti-rat. However, if somebody says something to you and they mean it as a compliment, then of course you take it as a compliment. And if they don't mean it as a compliment, well, you might as well take it as a compliment anyway, just for spite.
That's a good way to think about it. And for me, it's always a compliment because I just love those little creatures.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I think one of the things I really find interesting and very, very interesting, and I've been working on a book about this. I've written a few, had one book published, working on several others, and that is the concept of conscious awareness. And so any entity, any sentient being, any being that has senses and conscious awareness, of course, is very interesting to me. The whole concept of the nature of consciousness is extremely interesting to me. And if an animal, and all animals have conscious awareness, and so I think it's important to be decent to them and, just respect their area of the world. Don't act like a bully to anybody, much less animals and birds and things. Just be reasonable, be nice, And so I think that's an important thing, to respect the rights of others, and others includes other species, not just humans. And I don't think we're the smartest species on this planet either, by the way.
I definitely understand that, especially the more I learn about whales and cetaceans and
dolphins. Dolphins. Let's put it to you this way: dolphins understand any spoken human language, so they understand English and they can respond to commands and things like that. But there's no human that I'm aware of that understands dolphin. So that tells you something.
Yeah.
So their language is very complex. And what they can do, I don't know if you know this or not, but a dolphin can use its echolocation. It can make clicks and sounds underwater that will give it a visual image in its head of what is miles away underwater. So it'll give it an actual image. And then they'll get a sound back. And then they can memorize that sound and repeat it to other dolphins to show them pictures of areas under the water that they've seen through their echolocation.
I actually didn't know that. That's really fascinating.
Yeah, they have. It's incredible. They have a lot of evolutionary history, and they used to be land animals, and then, of course, they evolved from the sea onto the land, and then back into the sea again. But they seem to be extremely highly intelligent, which is why they don't tend to vote Republican. Yeah, am I allowed to say that?
Oh no, that's totally fine. We dunk on conservatives on the show all the time. You don't have to worry about any advertisers to piss off or anything.
No, because they do it to themselves. They're just. I don't want to give them the space. I really don't. But so anyway, now the other thing is, I know this may be something you have no interest in, and if you have no interest in it, that's perfectly fine. But if you do. If you don't, it's okay. Just tell me. But if you do, then that's good too. But one of my areas of interest is anything in the realm of philosophy, science, or philosophy. When I say philosophy, I'm not talking about philosophers. I'm talking about any philosophical concepts. So if you had any questions of a philosophical nature that have not been answered to your satisfaction, then I think you should throw them at me. Or if you have any unresolved paradoxes that you would like resolved, you could throw them at me.
I'll have to start thinking of some for next time then, because I don't have any with me right now. But I always enjoy hearing people talk about like how they view the world and their thoughts on things. And the stuff you've told me in the past, especially, has been interesting. We have about 20 minutes left, so if you'd like to, if you have plenty of time, if you'd like to talk about some of that.
Yeah, well, we could, if you want, I could just talk a little bit about some of that stuff. But
Sure.
I've written a book, and that book goes into details about my views of the nature of the universe, and I also answer the standard silly philosophical questions like which came first, the chicken or the egg, and that's an easy one. And when I wrote the book many years ago, and but it wasn't published until 2009, which is still many years ago, but it was written way earlier than that, because I had when I was growing up, I had all these questions about different things, and I've just always been the type of person who, if I have a question, I want the answer. And so if it's not out there in the public, I'm going to figure it out myself, because I know with certainty that if anyone has any question of any kind, as long as the question that they have makes sense and has meaning, has clear meaning, and is unambiguous, that there's an answer to the question. Now, that answer might not be accessible. Well, that's a separate issue, but any reasonable question has an answer. There is an answer. So I figure, just ask all the questions I want until I get the answers and figure them out. So one of them was the nature of the universe. And, people always ask this question about how did the universe begin, right? That's like a major question a lot of people ask. Is that right?
Yeah.
Right. Well, so I'm gonna put you on the spot here. It's not a difficult spot, but what's wrong with that question?
I guess it implies that because it came about, there was something before it.
Well, you've hit the nail almost on the head. If you ask the question, where did it come from, or how did the universe begin, which was really the question I asked, the question assumes that it began. It's like asking, do you still beat your wife? And you're not even married. It's like you're assuming too many things in the question. So the first question that they never ask is, they used to never ask. They probably do now, but it always was the case that they said the Big Bang was the beginning of the universe. Now, the Big Bang is an absolute fact. It's pretty clear that that's a fact, but it's not the beginning of the universe, and it's easy to understand that for a whole bunch of different reasons, not the least of which is the Big Bang is part of the universe, and we are part of the universe, but we're not part of the Big Bang, or we would be all condensed energy. So the Big Bang and we are part of a larger universe. And the definition of the universe is all of time and space and its contents, everything that exists. Everything that exists includes the future and includes the past. And if anybody thinks the future is not already written and done and over with, they are deeply mistaken, because everything exists that is real forever. So if something is, and if you think there's no reality, then who's thinking there's no reality? Is that not real? I mean, so there is reality, and everything that exists is permanent. There are different frames of reference from which to view things. And a lot of different frames of reference are completely accurate and legitimate. The difference is they're not the same. They don't show the same picture. They're not the same view. You're watching the same thing, but from a different angle. So it's going to look differently. So let's say one angle is from the point of view of humans who are traveling through time and space, at obviously less than the speed of light, because we're made out of matter. We have mass, rather, and we're made out of matter. And that makes us travel at speeds lower than the speed of light. However, from the point of view of light has to travel at the speed of light, which is about 286,000 miles a second, roughly. And from that point of view, if you were light and you had a point of view, everything would be frozen, and there'd be no space, and there'd be no time, and all of existence would exist altogether. And that's a real point of view. That's a real thing. That's the universe as a whole. So that if you turn on a light switch tomorrow, the light from that light switch is going out, it's radiating in all the directions. And if it's going to an area of the universe that's 20 light years away, that means if we were tracking it, it would take us 20 years until that light hit that spot. And then if it bounced back, it would take another 20 years to detect it. That would be a 40-year round trip. But from the point of view of light, it wouldn't take any time at all. And this has been proven over and over again. We know this because the faster we move things through space, the slower they move through time. That's what cyclotrons are all about. That's how they can smash atoms and find particles that people speculate might exist, subatomic particles like the Higgs boson or something like that, onto a giant photographic plate by speeding up through electromagnetism, speeding up atoms to as close to the speed of light as we can get them. And when we do that, a particle that would normally live inside an atom for, let's say, a millionth of a second, maybe that lifespan could be expanded to maybe a tenth of a second from our point of view, depending on how fast we can get it to move. So then it can be detected. See, I should put that on a record and sell it to Insomnia.
No, I'm enjoying this. I like hearing you talk.
But no, I mean, I think I should put. I think I'd make money putting it on, for Insomniacs.
Well, you never know. If you did want to do that and want to try putting it online, I could help.
To do what?
If you ever wanted to put recordings of yourself talking or your music or anything online, I could help with that. Because I do that as part of my podcast, so I'm a little knowledgeable about it.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. I appreciate that. I might at some point. I might actually ask you. I might ask for your advice on that. I really might.
No, I'd love to, and even if I don't know how, I would be able to find someone who is tech savvy enough to know how to. Because I mean, just from the circumstances of the time and place I was born, I have all this knowledge about computers and stuff. So I figure not everyone does, so I should put that to use as best I can for them.
Yeah, no, I'm sort of like half and half. Like I was on the internet before most people knew it existed, when it was BitNet, and it was just a bunch of universities and military installations connected to each other. And then it became very popular, and I got into chat rooms. And then when it, the initial chat rooms under BitNet were very pleasant. People would talk about whatever the topic was. You didn't have trolls in those days. But when it started to get more popular, you got all these people that come in there, and their only thing is to just disrupt everybody else. And I don't mind a troll if they're funny. I mean, if somebody says something funny and it's just to make people laugh or whatever, that's one thing. Yeah. But if they're just there to interrupt people communicating on the topic, just to be disruptive, then it's kind of frustrating. So that's what got me to stop going to chat rooms. I used to go into chat rooms and have discussions on topics, but the trolls sort of made it not worth my time. But I have some knowledge, and then other areas where my brain says no. So I appreciate that. So one of the things I'd like to do is I want to get out a record. I'm working on some music stuff, but I'm not an engineer, there was a device that I used once but it was in a studio and they told me how to use it. I think it was called a DX7. Does that ring a bell?
I'm not familiar with it.
Well, it's the keyboard that had editing built into it, where you could record different sounds and edit them and do different things with them. Because in most of my music, you might have noticed, depending on the degree of complexity that I think the piece may or may not call for, but depending on what I think is necessary, I usually have some pieces where there's one or two tracks that are completely backwards. not just to do backward tracks for its own sake, which is okay as far as I'm concerned, but because of the overall effect it would have. I had a very rare concept album. I can't even get a copy. I have a copy of it somewhere, but I want to release this on probably on vinyl. But it's I think a couple pieces I used on the least worst of. But the concept album was called "God Dares You to Buy This," and there were a few tracks on there where there were, let's say, it was recorded in 8-track or 16-track or whatever, and some of those tracks were rhythmic tracks that were recorded backwards. But what I did was I would tap out the rhythm I wanted the drummer to play, and I would tap out that rhythm, and they would play that rhythm. We would record it forwards, and then we would flip the tape over. This is an actual analog tape. So we'd flip it over and then listen to that track backwards, and they'd memorize the backwards pattern of that particular rhythm section. And then he would just have that memorized, and then we would record that and then flip that over so that would come out backwards. So it would be about the original pattern that I wanted, but it would be backwards. It wouldn't be backwards in terms of the pattern, but the pattern would have been recorded and played backwards.
No, like the musical version of the backwards talking in Twin Peaks, where you record yourself and play it backwards and then imitate the backwards sound. So when you reverse that, you're talking forwards.
Yeah, and I did that with a few pieces because I liked how it mixed in with the other elements, because it gave it an overall effect, a certain kind of feel to it that I liked. Because it depends on what the project is and what I want the music to do for that project, but in many cases, I think the music exists for the purpose of creating a mood, and probably in almost all cases. And there are things one can do to make the mood slightly different from a very similar mood. So in other words, if you want to label something as an eerie mood, well, there are a whole bunch of different kinds of eerie moods, and that have different flavors from each other. And if you want something to be sort of a humorous mood, well, there's all kinds of humorous. So discovering new ways of presenting something that lead to the kind of mood that one's looking for, that's really fun for me. And that's another aspect of what I enjoy about creating music.
Well, that's really great to hear, and honestly, it might serve as a great stopping point because we're bumping right up at the end of your 2 hours here.
Okay, well, that's fine. Well, it's very good speaking with you, and as I say hi to Fiona for me, and I hope things go nicely for all of you.
I will. It might take me a month or two for me to get it edited and everything, but once it's done, I'll totally send you a copy. And, in the future, if you ever feel like reaching out to me ever, I'd be happy to do a follow-up or just be a pen pal for you or something. Like I said, I've had a lot of fun talking with you.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, no, that's okay. You could stay in touch if you wish. That's perfectly fine, and as well. And it is nice speaking with you, and I hope things go well for you. And I assume you're completely recovered. Is that right?
Yeah, we've been fully recovered for a few weeks now. And honestly, I feel good, and I'm looking forward to the future.
Good. That's the way it should be. Always pay attention to the good stuff, because the bad stuff doesn't deserve it. All right. Nice speaking with you. Take care.
You too, Michael.